Part 1. The sun hung low over the dusty horizon as Marcus Holloway finished securing the last fence post of the day. His weathered hands, scarred from years of hard labor, gripped the wooden stake as he surveyed his sprawling ranch. At 38, he had built something substantial from nothing. 2,000 acres of prime grazing land, a herd of prize cattle, and a reputation for fair dealing that stretched across 3 counties. Yet for all his success, the silence that greeted him each evening when he returned to his empty farmhouse felt heavier than the tools he carried. Marcus had always been a man of few words, preferring the company of his horses and cattle to the complicated dance of human relationships. His last serious relationship had ended 5 years ago when Sarah decided she couldn't handle the isolation of ranch life. Since then, he'd thrown himself into his work with renewed intensity, convincing himself that solitude was a choice rather than a burden he bore. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his thoughts. Tom Bradley, his nearest neighbor and longtime friend, rode up on his chestnut mare, his face grim beneath his worn cowboy hat. "Marcus," Tom called out, dismounting with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent more years in the saddle than on foot. "Got a minute?" "Always do for you, Tom." "What's eating at you?" Tom removed his hat, running his fingers through his graying hair. "It's about Jake Morrison. You know him?" Marcus nodded slowly. Jake Morrison was known throughout the county as a drunk and a wastrel, a man who'd inherited good land and squandered it through poor decisions and worse habits. "What about him?" "He's in town, drunk as a lord, trying to sell his daughter to anyone who'll pay his gambling debts." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd seen desperation drive men to terrible choices, but this crossed every line of human decency. His daughter? How old is she? 19, maybe 20. Name's Elena. Pretty little thing, but Tom hesitated, his discomfort evident. "She's deaf, Marcus. Been that way since she was a child, from what I hear. Jake's been telling everyone she's useless, can't work, can't contribute nothing to a household." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. The casual cruelty of it made his stomach turn. "Where is she now?" "Still in town, I reckon. Sheriff's trying to figure out what to do. Jake owes money to some dangerous people, and he's desperate enough to go through with it." Without another word, Marcus strode toward the barn where his truck was parked. Tom followed, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Marcus, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that no human being should be sold like livestock." Marcus yanked open the truck door. "How much does Jake owe?" Tom's eyes widened. "You can't be serious. Word is he's into them for about $8,000. Marcus didn't hesitate. "I've got that much in my savings. More, if needed." "But Marcus, you don't know anything about caring for a deaf person. Hell, you barely know sign language." "I'll learn." Marcus started the engine. "That girl deserves better than being treated like property." The drive to town took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Marcus's mind raced with questions and doubts. What was he doing? He knew nothing about Elena Morrison except that she was deaf and desperate, but the image of someone being sold like cattle on his watch made his decision feel inevitable. The main street of Cedar Falls was unusually busy for a Tuesday evening. Marcus parked outside Murphy's saloon where a small crowd had gathered. Through the dusty windows he could see Jake Morrison gesticulating wildly, his voice carrying even through the glass. Marcus pushed through the crowd and entered the saloon. The smell of stale beer and tobacco smoke assaulted his senses. Jake Morrison stood at the bar, swaying slightly, his clothes disheveled, and his eyes bloodshot. Beside him, pressed against the wall as if trying to disappear, stood a young woman with dark hair and large, frightened eyes. Elena Morrison was indeed beautiful, with delicate features and an ethereal quality that seemed out of place in the rough surroundings. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days, and her hands trembled slightly as she watched her father's increasingly agitated gestures. "8,000, Jake was saying to a group of men who looked more interested in the spectacle than in actually helping. "That's all I need. She's young, she's healthy, and she'll do whatever you tell her. Can't talk back, neither." The men laughed, but it was an uncomfortable sound. Even hardened cowboys had limits to their callousness. Marcus stepped forward, his presence immediately commanding attention. At 6 feet 3 inches with broad shoulders and a reputation for both fairness and fierceness when crossed, he was not a man to be ignored. "Jake," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the noise, "I hear you're in some financial trouble." Jake's eyes lit up with desperate hope. "Marcus Holloway, didn't expect to see you here. Yeah, I got some debts that need paying, and fast. And you think selling your daughter is the solution?" The saloon fell silent. Jake's face flushed, but whether from shame or anger, Marcus couldn't tell. Now see here, Marcus. This ain't none of your business. A man's got to do what a man's got to do. Marcus glanced at Elena, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. Even unable to hear the words, she seemed to understand the tension in the room, the way all eyes kept shifting between her and her father. How much do you owe? 8,000, but like I said, this ain't your concern. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out his checkbook. The sight of it made Jake's eyes go wide. I'll give you 10,000 for her freedom. Her freedom? Jake laughed bitterly. She ain't a slave, Marcus, she's my daughter. Then start acting like a father instead of a pimp. The insult hit home. Jake's face contorted with rage. But before he could respond, Marcus continued. $10,000 right now. You pay your debts and Elena comes with me. She'll be treated with respect and dignity, something she's obviously not getting here. Jake looked around the saloon, seeing the mixture of disgust and pity in the faces surrounding him. For a moment, Marcus thought he might refuse, that some spark of paternal instinct might reassert itself. But then Jake's shoulders sagged, and the fight went out of him. 10,000, he repeated quietly, in exchange for which you give up all parental rights. You don't contact her, you don't visit, you don't interfere in her life in any way. She's free to make her own choices. Marcus wrote out the check with steady hands, though inside he was questioning his sanity. What was he doing? He was essentially buying a human being, even if his intentions were honorable. But looking at Elena's frightened face, he knew he couldn't walk away. Jake took the check with shaking hands, staring at it as if it might disappear. She can't hear nothing, Marcus. Hasn't since she was 7. Doctor said it was from a fever, but he trailed off, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Marcus had a sudden suspicion about the real cause of Elena's deafness, but he pushed it aside. Whatever had happened in the past, his focus had to be on the present. He approached Elena slowly, his movements careful and non-threatening. She watched him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. When he was close enough, he pointed to himself and mouthed his name clearly. Marcus. Elena's eyes widened slightly. She pointed to herself and mouthed back, Elena. Marcus nodded and smiled, hoping to convey reassurance. He gestured toward the door and raised his eyebrows in a question. Elena looked toward her father, who was already heading for the door with his check, eager to settle his debts before anyone could change their minds. Elena's gaze returned to Marcus, and after a long moment she nodded. The ride back to the ranch was conducted in complete silence, but it was a different kind of silence than Marcus was used to. Elena sat pressed against the passenger door, her hands folded in her lap, occasionally glancing at him with those large, dark eyes. Marcus found himself hyper-aware of every bump in the road, every turn, wondering what she was thinking. When they reached the ranch, Marcus parked in front of the main house and turned to face Elena. In the dim light from the porch, he could see her taking in her surroundings, the well-maintained buildings, the neat fencing, the signs of prosperity and care. He got out and walked around to her side of the truck, opening the door for her. Elena stepped out carefully, her movements graceful despite her obvious nervousness. Marcus gestured toward the house and began walking toward the front door, looking back to make sure she was following. The house was larger than it appeared from the outside, with a spacious living room, a modern kitchen, and 4 bedrooms. Marcus had built it with the intention of someday having a family, though that dream had seemed increasingly distant as the years passed. In the living room, Elena stood in the center of the space, turning slowly to take everything in. The furniture was simple but comfortable, the walls lined with bookshelves and photographs of the ranch through the years. It was clearly a bachelor's home, but it was clean and well organized. Marcus disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a glass of water, which he offered to Elena. She accepted it with a small nod of thanks, her fingers brushing his briefly as she took the glass. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through him. He pointed to one of the bedrooms down the hall and gestured for her to follow. The room was furnished with a double bed, a dresser, and a small desk. Fresh linens were folded on the bed, and the windows looked out over the pasture where his horses grazed. Elena entered the room hesitantly, touching the bed frame, the dresser, as if confirming they were real. When she turned back to Marcus, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Marcus wanted to reassure her, to tell her she was safe now, that she would be treated with kindness and respect. But how could he communicate such complex ideas to someone who couldn't hear? He settled for placing his hand over his heart, and then extending it toward her, hoping she would understand the gesture as one of good faith. Elena studied his face for a long moment, then slowly nodded. She placed her own hand over her heart, and then extended it toward him, mirroring his gesture. Over the next few days, Marcus found himself completely out of his depth. He'd never realized how much of communication depended on sound until he was trying to live with someone who couldn't hear. Simple things like calling her for meals or asking if she needed anything became complex challenges. Elena, for her part, seemed to be adjusting better than he was. She explored the house and grounds with quiet curiosity, helping with small tasks without being asked. She had a natural grace that made even mundane activities seem elegant, and Marcus found himself watching her more often than he cared to admit. On the third morning, Marcus woke to find Elena in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. She'd somehow managed to locate all the ingredients and was making what looked like the most elaborate meal the kitchen had seen in years. The smell of bacon and fresh biscuits filled the air, and Marcus's stomach growled in appreciation. When Elena saw him, she smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, and gestured toward the table. Marcus sat down, feeling oddly moved by the domesticity of the moment. When was the last time someone had cooked for him? As they ate, Marcus found himself studying Elena more closely. There was something about her expressions, the way she reacted to things, that nagged at him. She seemed to anticipate sounds, turning toward the door before he heard the truck coming up the drive, flinching slightly when he dropped his fork even though she shouldn't have been able to hear it. After breakfast, Marcus had to ride out to check on the cattle in the north pasture. He tried to indicate to Elena that he would be back by evening, pointing to the sun and making a sweeping gesture across the sky. She nodded, seeming to understand. When he returned at sunset, bone-weary and dusty, he found Elena sitting on the front porch mending one of his shirts. She looked up as he approached, and again he had that strange feeling that she was reacting to sounds she supposedly couldn't hear. That evening, as they sat in the living room, Marcus reading and Elena working on some embroidery she'd found in one of the drawers, Marcus made a decision. He closed his book and moved to sit closer to her. Elena looked up, her needle poised mid-stitch. Marcus pointed to himself and then to her, then made a talking gesture with his hands. Elena's eyes widened and she shook her head, pointing to her ears. Marcus persisted. He stood up and moved behind her chair, far enough back that she couldn't see him. Then, very quietly, he said, "Elena." She turned around. Marcus felt his heart begin to race. He moved to another position, behind and to the side, where she definitely couldn't see him. "Elena," he whispered again. Once again she turned toward the sound of his voice. Marcus came around to face her, his expression serious. Elena's face had gone pale, and her hands were shaking. He knelt down in front of her chair and gently took her hands in his. "You can hear me," he said softly. Elena's eyes filled with tears and she began to shake her head frantically. But Marcus held her hands firmly, not in a threatening way but in a way that conveyed he wasn't going to let her retreat from this truth. "Elena, you can hear me. I don't know why you've been pretending you can't, but you can hear every word I'm saying." For a long moment they stared at each other. Elena's face was a mask of fear and something else. Shame? Guilt? Marcus couldn't tell. Then slowly she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can hear you." Marcus felt a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite sort out. Relief that his suspicions had been correct, confusion about why she'd been pretending, and a strange sense of betrayal. But looking at her terrified face, he pushed aside his own feelings and focused on hers. "Why?" he asked gently. "Why pretend to be deaf?" Elena's tears began to fall in earnest now. "Because," she said, her voice rusty from disuse, "it was the only way to survive." Marcus waited, sensing there was more to the story. Elena pulled her hands from his and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "When I was 7, my father," she began, then stopped, her voice catching. "He hit me. Hard. I couldn't hear for weeks after that. The doctor said it might be permanent, and my father, he was almost relieved. Said a deaf daughter was less trouble than a hearing one." Marcus felt a cold rage building in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "But your hearing came back?" Elena nodded. "Gradually. By the time I was 10, I could hear almost everything. But by then I'd learned that being deaf meant being invisible. People would say things in front of me they'd never say otherwise. I learned things about my father, about his business dealings, about the kind of man he really was. And I learned that as long as he thought I couldn't hear, I was safer." "Safer how?" Elena's face crumpled. "He never tried to use me the way he used other women. He never brought men around to look at me that way. As long as I was his poor, deaf daughter, I was protected from the worst of what he might have done." Marcus felt sick. The full horror of Elena's situation was becoming clear. She'd spent over a decade pretending to be deaf to protect herself from her father's abuse and exploitation. But why continue the pretense now? You're safe here. Elena looked at him with those dark, haunted eyes. Am I? You bought me, Marcus. You paid $10,000 for me. How do I know you won't expect certain things in return? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. He sat back on his heels, staring at her. Is that what you think? That I bought you for sexual purposes? Elena's silence was answer enough. Marcus stood up abruptly, running his hands through his hair. Jesus, Elena. No, that's not… I would never… He began pacing the room, his mind racing. How could he convince her that his intentions were honorable? How could he make her understand that he'd acted out of compassion, not lust? Elena, he said finally, turning to face her. I want you to listen to me very carefully. I didn't buy you. I paid your father's debts to free you from an impossible situation. You don't owe me anything. Not anything. You're free to leave tomorrow if you want to. I'll give you money, help you get settled somewhere else. Whatever you need. Elena stared at him, her expression unreadable. And if I want to stay? Then you stay. As my guest, not as my property. You can help around the ranch if you want to, or not. You can eat at my table or take your meals separately. You can talk to me or maintain your silence. It's your choice. And you expect nothing in return? Marcus met her gaze steadily. I expect nothing. I hope for friendship, maybe, in time, but I expect nothing. They stood there in the lamp-lit living room, the weight of this revelation settling between them like a living thing. Marcus could see Elena processing his words, weighing them against her years of experience with men who saw her as nothing more than a commodity. I don't know how to trust, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Then don't. Not yet. But maybe you could learn. We both could. Elena wiped her eyes again and straightened her shoulders. I'd like to stay. For a while, at least. Marcus felt something loosen in his chest. I'd like that too. As they settled back into their evening routine, Elena returning to her embroidery and Marcus to his book. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer the silence of deception and fear, but the comfortable quiet of two people beginning to understand each other. Over the following weeks, Elena slowly began to emerge from the protective shell she'd built around herself. She started speaking more, though her voice remained soft and hesitant. She helped with the ranch work, proving herself to be surprisingly capable and hardworking. And gradually Marcus began to see glimpses of the woman she might have been if fear hadn't shaped so much of her life. They developed a routine that worked for both of them. Elena would rise early to prepare breakfast and tend to the garden she'd started behind the house. Marcus would spend his days working with the cattle and horses, often returning to find Elena reading in the living room or working on various projects around the house. Evenings were spent in comfortable companionship. Marcus would tell Elena about his day, and she would share small observations about life on the ranch. She had a sharp mind and a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard sometimes. He found himself looking forward to these conversations more than he cared to admit. One evening, about a month after the truth had come out, Marcus found Elena sitting on the front porch staring out at the sunset. She looked peaceful, more relaxed than he'd ever seen her. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling into the chair beside her. Elena smiled. "I was just thinking about how different my life is now. A month ago, I was terrified every day, never knowing what my father might do next. Now I'm sitting on a porch, watching the sunset, and I feel safe. It's been so long since I felt safe." Marcus felt a warmth spread through his chest. "I'm glad." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky change colors. Then Elena spoke again. "Marcus, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you do it, really? Why did you pay to free me?" Marcus considered the question. It was one he'd been asking himself for weeks. "I don't know if I can explain it properly. I saw you standing there in that saloon and I saw the fear in your eyes. I thought about what it would be like to be in your position, to have no control over your own life. I couldn't walk away from that. But you didn't know me. You had no reason to care what happened to me. I didn't need to know you to know that what was happening was wrong. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity." Elena turned to look at him. "You're a good man, Marcus Holloway." "I'm just a man, Elena. Nothing special. You're wrong about that." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Marcus found himself wondering about the future. Elena had been with him for over a month now, and he couldn't imagine the ranch without her. But he also knew that she was still healing, still learning to trust. Whatever might develop between them would have to happen naturally, in its own time. For now, it was enough to sit here beside her, watching the night sky and feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Contentment. Not the forced satisfaction of a man convincing himself he didn't need anyone, but the deep, quiet contentment of someone who had found an unexpected companion in the loneliness of ranch life. Elena's soft voice broke into his thoughts. "Marcus? Yeah? Thank you. For giving me my freedom. For giving me a chance to discover who I really am." Marcus looked at her, this woman who had survived so much and was now finding her way back to herself. "Thank you for staying, for trusting me enough to let me be part of that discovery." As they sat there under the vast Montana sky, both of them knew that something significant had shifted between them. The foundation of trust that had been slowly building was growing stronger, and with it the possibility of something neither of them had dared to hope for, a future built on mutual respect, understanding, and perhaps, in time, love.